Right, so we're going to go ahead and start our intros. Once again, welcome to Justice and Public Health. Today we're talking about toward an anti-racist public health of radical possibility on power, epistemology, and creative resistance for health justice. This is the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. My name is Lauren Jones. I use she, her pronouns, and I want to welcome you all to another edition of Justice and Public Health. Before we begin, I want to first acknowledge that our school and the university are built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for this region, Minnesota Makoche, which loosely translates to the land where the waters reflect the skies. We're going to share some concrete resources for supporting our Indigenous relatives in the chat very shortly, so please pay attention to that. I also want to point out that closed captioning is available for this event. You can access that by using the icon in the bottom right corner of your screen. You can also reach out to Sarah Harris, who is providing our tech support today, via the chat to ask questions about accessibility. We'll monitor the chat for questions as well as share links to our evaluation and information about future justice and public health events. The Justice and Public Health series was started in 2021 as part of the School of Public Health's commitment to justice and anti-racism. We've been hosting monthly events with local and national experts around the topics of public health. The speakers and presentations in the series help to ground us in theory and practice, as well as complement the classroom learning that our students experience. We also hope that today's discussion is part of a broader change happening outside of the School of Public Health. If you're interested in staying abreast of other justice and public health events, please be sure to fill out our event evaluation after this, towards the end of the event, and check the box to receive notifications about upcoming events. You can also visit our website at any time. This event is being recorded and will be available on our website for about 180 days. Now I'm going to move into introducing our speaker. By the way, apologies for that background sound. My laptop is trying to update. But Dr. Ryan J. Petway, Dr. PH, MPH, is a public health scholar, educator, and poet who integrates social epidemiology, participatory research, and creative arts to advance health equity. He engages critical Black feminist and decolonial theory and methods to pursue procedural and epistemic justice and advance anti-racist praxis within public health research and practice, including via satire, humor, music, and poetry. Essential to this work are considerations of structural racism, white supremacy, and settler-colonialism as germane to matters of misrepresentation and narrative power within public health research, practice, and pedagogy. I'm going to skip a little bit of this. Core to this collaborative work is centering poetry as both a legitimate form of knowledge acquisition, expression, and an indispensable mode/space of healing and resistance for youth of color to counter dominant narratives. In advancing this work for the broader field, he co-founded and serves as an associate editor for the first ever standing poetry department in a peer-reviewed public health journal. Prior to his doctoral training, Dr. Petway served as social epidemiologist and chief epidemiologist for the Baltimore City Health Department. Before that, he sat on bench backs and sipped orange drink, listening to Mobb Deep while conducting observational studies of Project Life. Hashtag first gen. He still reps the Ville. Please help me welcome Dr. Ryan Petway.
Hello, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm gonna skip right into things. Before I do that, I'm gonna read a poem because y'all should know it's Black History Month, and I'm a huge Audre Lorde fan. She inspires a lot of my work. And so her birthday was on Sunday, I believe. And so I'm gonna lift that up and I'm gonna read a poem for y'all as I open this up. This is called A Litany for Survival. from 1978. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Litany for Survival, Audre Lorde. So ground us in that and move us into the thing. Um, so in addition to really drawing from Audre Lorde, I also draw quite a bit from Bell Hooks' work in writing in terms of resistance. And so the title of this talk is from a passage from a chapter in her book, Yearning. And for me, it grounds a lot of my work and my scholarship, particularly around the intersections of poetry and public health. I think that, as I'll allude to, or I'll speak to more directly later on this talk, oftentimes when we think about anti-racism and racial health inequalities and the research that we need and the stories and the evidence that we need to advance change, oftentimes we're generating evidence and stories that are centered in damage and harm and all these negative representations. And I feel like what Bell Hooks really speaks to eloquently is this idea that, yes, even if we were in some margin or another, an intersection of many margins, that this marginality space is a site of radical possibility and a space of resistance, and it allows us to imagine alternatives, right? And I think that's often what is missing from research on health equities, racial health inequalities research, right? Is that we're so anchored in the usual, right? Trying to find damage and harm, and that we forget sometimes that we can find other things and tell other stories, and that some of these other stories might be more conducive to that political and social change that we say that we want. So, getting us going. So I started this off with Audre Lorde's poem. With this section, I'm going to speak to power-knowledge relations in public health, this idea of epistemology. What is that? Some of y'all are like, what the fuck is epistemology? I mean, I'm just saying, like, it's not required for anybody's public health training. It's not even mentioned in the CEPA accreditation documents. People are trained in epidemiology, and they never have to engage any critical thinking about the logics and the methods that undergird epidemiology, whether or not it's an appropriate epistemological orientation to actually advance social justice or health justice for that matter. So I'll speak to some of that in terms of the white settler-colonial logics that undergird much of public health. Then I'll touch on epistemic violence. And then I'll get into what I'm calling here practice, integrating and pushing back on some of those foundations that I think are questionable for us, right? And I'll introduce some thinking around creative resistance. This reference here, Ain't Got No, I Got Life, is to a Nina Simone song, Nina Simone was also born in February. This song Ain't Got No, I Got Life, if y'all are familiar with it. And for those that are not, the song is basically this narrative, counter narrative, right? There's a whole dominant narrative where she's saying about all the things that she doesn't have, right? In the context of structural racism and gender inequality, right? And class inequality. And then the second half of the song, she's like, that's cool. Or the second half of like the verses, she's like, that's cool. I ain't got that shit. But what I do have is this, right? And I think that's what's missing from public health research on racial inequalities is that we only seem to be focusing on the things that we don't have and the harms. And we need to do those things for evidence purposes, right? To some extent. But there's more to our story. There's more to our histories. There's more to our futures. than just talking about what we don't have and all the harms that have been done to us, right? And so I have a quote here from a poem from Langston Hughes from his poem My People that I think offers up this idea of counter narrative as well. Langston Hughes is also born in February. If you haven't noticed, I'm trying to like get us going for Black History Month here. For praxis, I'm gonna talk about my soul being intact. Also, Nina Simone's song from the Young, Gifted, and Black. My soul's intact. Being Black, that's where it's at. I'm going to share some examples of my own work where I engage creative resistance and try to push back to these dominant narratives and outline how we might be able to integrate public health critical race praxis and decolonial methods and theory to create a future that just looks and feels better. And at the end of the day, I love this quote from Nipsey from his song Hustle and Motivate. Um, Sometimes we just gotta say the things. If no one else is saying the things and we're like waiting for permission to say the things, we're gonna be here waiting a long time. So we have to have the audacity to just try to see something differently, to imagine alternatives. And I think that that's what I'm gonna try to do this talk. All right, so first, a few things about power. As I like to say, Foucault and Freire are two of my favorite F words. I don't think that we should really be doing a whole lot of research and engaging in methods, especially epidemiology, without really critically engaging power knowledge relations. Um, so what Freire talks about is, Foucault talks about is this idea that, knowledge is, as we have heard quite a bit of, I guess more recently, is socially produced, is politically contingent, right? And what he talks about is this idea of repressive and productive power and objects, the ritual and the privilege, right? And so in public health, for me, I see these things manifesting themselves in the types of research as evidenced by the types of research that are centered within public health discourse around racial health inequalities, right? So what type of knowledge are we producing, right? What type of knowable objects are we creating, right? What's the ritual for producing those objects? So we, get a big grant. We collect some data based on surveys and some biospecimens. We run regressions. We tweak the regression. We publish a paper. We pay an article processing fee, or it's behind a paywall. We put it on our CV. We put that data in our next grant, and we do the whole thing again, right? And in that ritual, there are people on editorial boards that decide whether or not they think this is worthy of being published, right? And then there are peer reviewers, peer reviewers in quotes that are looking at somebody's research, deciding whether or not they think that should even make it to make it out to the world, right? There's this whole ritual, right? And before that ritual, that part of the ritual, you have to be a part of the privilege. You have to be credentialed as a scholar, right? So what's that process for that? You have to go to this training program and this training program and get this degree and get this degree. In order to prove yourself, for example, as an epidemiologist, you have to follow the guidelines set by, for example, CEP, the Council on Education for Public Health. What are the core competencies that are required for you to be a credentialed epidemiologist and go on and do scholarship, right? What are the rules and the boundaries and the parameters that you're required to engage in, and what is not included in that training process, right? These are all examples of repressive productive power that lead to the type of knowledge that is produced, or the types of things that are seen as knowledge once they are produced. I think when I think about these things, I also think about Patricia Hill Collins' work on the four domains of power, and especially disciplinary and hegemonic power. Disciplinary power, for me, I think about this quite a bit when I think about survey research or the use of anything that we're going to basically do huge, like large sample research on multiple political jurisdictions, right? Multiple county comparisons, Burfist, national data, NHANES, these longitudinal big data set things, right? Not always longitudinal, oftentimes cross-sectional, but still. This is what is seen as like a good study. You need a big sample, you need to use these methods, you need to control for this, and you need to do something to make sure that your effect estimate is robust, right? If you don't do those things, that does not count as research or knowledge, right? It's not legit. And within that process, oftentimes what we see in public health, especially for racial inequalities, is that we have to do that research as a part of this ritual on a particular thing. Certain things will be funded and certain things will not be funded. The NIH does not have a National Institutes for Studying Black Joy. It's not random. Y'all might be thinking like, why would we have that? Well, why the fuck do we have what we have? Somebody decided that these are the important things. And these are the methods that we need to have to answer the questions that related to the important things. And these are the questions about the important things. And they create this entire disciplinary structure and this hegemonic narrative about what we can do, how we must do it, and then the narratives that we create around it, right? And so when we say things like people are at risk or at greater risk than or vulnerable, that type of language, right? That's a certain narrative, right? Did not just fall from the sky. We created it. And then because we're so wedded to that narrative, we keep on doing research that perpetuates that narrative. And this tends to be the only thing we fund. What I suggest the consequence of this balance of, the privilege, right? Is this is what we're looking at in terms of tenure-track faculty nationally. Sorry, go back. Less than 6% Black, less than 6% Latinx, and 0.3% Indigenous. I did the numbers on this once. I think it was one Indigenous tenure-track public health faculty member for every 700 or 750 white tenure-track faculty members. And keeping in mind that the entire landmass that most of us are standing on right now, sitting on right now, is Indigenous. Editorial boards, very similar story, 77% white, 1% Black, 3.8% Latinx, 88% straight. So just saying these things right now, I ask to ask questions for folks from various margins, right? Do you feel confident and comfortable with the folks that are making decisions about whether or not the research you're doing should be published, based on what you're seeing here? Do you think that they have sat themselves down in community spaces and engaged in the literature and engaged in conversation and felt the love and the joy in these margins to determine whether or not the story you're trying to tell, the research you're trying to do about certain communities is worthy of seeing the light of day after peer review, right? It's a very similar story for NIH grant review boards, right? This whole apparatus is essentially structured by the dominant, the dominant perspective. And it doesn't look too promising, I would suggest. And these are what this graph shows here is the percentages of folks that are getting bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees, and then going on to be professors, like tenure-track professors, right? 15% for Black students, 17% for Latinx, 13% for Asian American Pacific Islander, 1% for Indigenous in terms of bachelor's, and then so on and so on. And you see that there's generally, as you would expect for most things, I guess, there's a drop off. And so for me, what I'm concerned about as we talk about anti-racism and decolonizing is that do we really think that we can get to that future that we want, knowing we were never meant to survive in the first place, and we picked up the apparatus that was built before us, right? We picked up the master's tools and kept using those tools to do anti-racism and decolonizing when the demographics and the folks that are doing the work are using the same tools, right? We inherited these conditions. Do we think we can actually produce a different future by doing the same thing with the same folks that have been doing the same things? I just don't know whether or not that's going to be possible. Breathe and drink water. So this quote from MLK from Letter from a Birmingham Jail, he talks about white moderates being worse than expressly racist white folks because they're out here basically stalling and tiptoeing around the things, right? They don't really have the courage or necessarily even the interest to actually pursue that justice, right? And I suggest that there's a lot of folks that are in public health that are essentially functioning as white moderates. And I wrote about this in the health affairs piece, that public health academia is a whole ass white moderate. Otherwise, how would you explain the lack of progress that we've seen in terms of the demographics about who's in the space, peer review boards, all the things, right? And Toni Morrison also birthday February. Actually, I think maybe Toni Morrison was born on February 21st. So today, happy birthday. This quote here, she gave this in a keynote speech at Portland State University, where I'm at. Very serious function of racism is distraction. It wants to keep you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. I suggest that this is a very familiar situation in public health research. Folks are out here writing grant after grant, publishing paper after paper on a topic that's been, 25,000 papers published on, right? And we're doing this why? Because somebody tells us we need more evidence, we need more research. This is how racism works, right? We do not need 40,000 papers to show anything to anybody. We didn't have any research to guarantee the privileges that other folks have. We didn't have to justify that with some burden of evidence, right? The fact that we think that we can win this game and pursue and achieve health justice or approximate health justice by research, those are white logics for you. What do I mean by this? Zubiri and Bonilla Silva talk about a context in which white supremacy has defined the techniques and processes of reasoning about social facts. It assumes a historical posture that grants eternal objectivity to the views of elite whites and condemns the views of non-whites to perpetual subjectivity. They go on to say that race and gender and class are important not only as subjects for investigation, but as structural factors that partly shape researchers and their scientific gaze. The larger idea here, at least one of them being that none of us are showing up in these spaces as researchers, just randomly doing the things, right? We are conditioned by our own communities and our own epistemologies that we had before we decided we want to do research on a thing. And that shapes how we do the research, why we're doing the research. In the context of US um, population health research, sociological research, it's been from a dominant white gaze, right? What do white folks think about Black folks that they have never interacted with, right? Do we think that we can actually understand what's going on and do these research things without actually having any type of real conversation relationship with those histories and those communities, right? And then when folks speak from the margins, do we entertain their knowledge as real knowledge? Since it doesn't fit into the methods that we decide are important in our worldviews, it's not an odds ratio, it's not a relative risk, so therefore it's not real, right? And we do this in public health because most folks are conditioned to think that somehow there's a hierarchy of methods, right? The positivist, highly empirical, quantitative methods are first. And if we don't have that, then we don't have any knowledge at all. We can't take any action. If we just have a couple interviews, that's cute, right? That's what we do in public health. And the thing is, I've never seen any empirical research that shows that quantitative methods are more capable of producing social change than qualitative methods, right? I have seen, 25,000 papers on air pollution and asthma, empirical papers, and the relationship between air pollution and asthma is quite the same in terms of inequalities, right? And so for me, I suggest this is because public health is rooted in these logics, these positivist, white supremacist logics about the tools that we can and cannot use. And what they say about the methods that these are the practical tools used to manufacture empirical data analysis to support the racial stratification of society used to produce racial knowledge. I want to make a point here and emphasize this. I think sometimes that folks think that they can play the diversity game and simply like, oh, look, we have 5 more Black and brown students. We have, 2 trans students. We have, 5 first-gen students. Therefore, we're winning. And I'm here to tell y'all that's not how this works, right? In terms of racialized, settler-colonial, white supremacist logics, people of color engage in the same practices, right? White logics and white being racialized as white are not coterminous. There's plenty of POC in public health academic spaces that are dripping white logics. If you get a PhD in an institution that is anchored in it, and your CEEP accreditations tell you this is what real epidemiology is, it doesn't matter if you're racialized as white or not. You are internalizing and engaging in those same logics unless you're pushing back and critically interrogating them, right? So as I suggest, white logic and white methods can be and have been used by members of all racialized groups. In terms of settler colonial logics, for me, I just want to lift up one particular thing here is this idea of commodification that Linda Smith, feminist decolonial scholar, talks about. This idea that the production of knowledge, new knowledge, and transformed old knowledge, ideas about the nature of knowledge and the validity of specific forms of knowledge became as much commodities of colonial exploitation as other natural resources. Now she's talking about this in the case of settler colonial context involving indigenous communities. For me, I see this as being very germane to the context in which the settler colonial and extractivist relationship that we have between dominant institutions going into communities of color, extracting data, publishing papers, and making a bunch of money off of this, right? And so what I have here, fiscal administrative fees, and I realize I need to update these numbers. 12 to 40% is probably not accurate. I bet Minnesota is probably like 54% at this point. I don't know. Article processing charges $3,000 to get your paper published, right? If you don't have that, then you get paid $39.95 to download it, right? And the folks whose data is used to create the knowledge, right, don't have access to those things, right? This essentially is mining communities at the margins for their data to make profit for somebody else, right? Our universities, if a $10 million grant is getting written, our universities are getting $5.4 million to do whatever the fuck they want with, right? It has nothing to do with advancing health inequality or advancing health equity at all. They just get to do whatever they want with $5.4 million. Racial health inequalities research is racial capitalist, settler-colonial extractivism. And I will die on that hill until I see something different. And for me, this is what I think that is the relevance to this idea of the white possessive, Eileen Moore Robinson work. This idea that even in the context of things that don't necessarily have to involve dominant institutions, right? But there's a mode of rationalization that's underpinned by an excessive desire to invest in reproducing and reaffirming a nation state's ownership, control, and domination. I see this concept as relevant to most racial health inequalities research in the sense that we know who the folks are disproportionately who are doing the research, right? In terms of tenure-track faculty, we know who's on the editorial boards, deciding whether or not something's going to get sent out for review, and then we know what the body of the peer reviewers generally is. We know who's deciding what's going to get funded, right? And so all of this is mechanisms of control that disciplinary and hegemonic power being exercised, that repressive and reductive power being exercised all throughout the way, even though what we're concerned about is perhaps what's going on in communities of color. But communities of color don't have control over the thing at all. That's being controlled by an outside institution that is saturated in these white supremacist settler-colonial logics. And then matters of data ownership, right? For me, I suggest that this creates a context where public health is just, it's like a grand monument to epistemic violence. Chrissy Dodson, Black feminist philosopher, talks about this idea of epistemic violence, particularly in the context where there is knowledge at the margins that is essentially being silenced, right? She talks about this idea of testimonial quieting, testimonial smothering, and testimonial incompetence. And with the testimonial quieting, which she discusses, is this idea that you know, in conversations or in contexts in which someone is speaking from the margins to a dominant, someone who is in the center of the space, right? That knowledge is essentially dismissed and seen as not legitimate, right? You're speaking from the margins, we have nothing of relevance or of significance that we contribute to the conversation. Let's just move on here, right? We're not taken seriously because we're not basically playing the game the way the game has been designed, right? We're not doing this, we're not saying this, therefore this isn't actually real knowledge here, right? It has to look like this, it has to feel like this, and it has to be about this. If it's about this, we're not going to engage that. She refers to that as testimonial quieting. And she talks about testimonial smothering, this idea that once we have been quieted so many times, our testimony has been quieted so many times, we essentially learn to smother our own testimony. We no longer are willing to share our ideas or our knowledges from the margins, right? We have this fear now. We're afraid to actually step into the space and share what we know to be true from our own lived and embodied experiences, right? Because we've been harmed so many times by the quieting. Why would we continue to try to hold space in a conversation and share our knowledges, right? And then with the testimonial incompetence, for me, I see this concept being relevant, for example, the context of public health pedagogy, right? Um, you know, Folks have 45 credit or 60 credit master's degree programs for epidemiology or health promotion, right? And, as I've written about before, like I challenge folks to go through that entire 45 credit curriculum and find one study that talks about Black folks in a way that centers their joy or their love, right? Is there a study that shows that, Black joy goes up by 3% as, something else modifies, right? You won't find that study on the public health syllabus anywhere. Most of the time when you're going to learn about health in Black communities in a 60 credit program, every time you hear about it, it's going to be how worse off communities of color are compared to a white community, right? And so with this idea of testimonial incompetence, this idea is that do we believe we're training folks that are capable of holding space once they get out into the real world to work in communities of color? If they've been trained with 60 credit hours with only a deficits and a negative lens on what's going on in communities of color, right? Are they competent to be public health professionals or future scholars, right? Would they be testimonially competent to hold space? I think we know the answer to that. So what I suggest, and others have suggested, is that public health basically is structurally racist. And I have seen no evidence to the contrary. I'm open to have a conversation about that. We'll see how it goes. Maybe things will change, but right now, based on the ways in which we value or devalue forms of knowledge and research, and the narratives that we allow ourselves to tell or not tell, the space we create or do not create, our silences, our erasures, our omissions. There's nothing that suggests that public health is even remotely approximating or approaching anti-racism. It is structurally racist. We have to fundamentally rearrange the entire apparatus if we want to produce an anti-racist public health future. Drink water. Shout out to Jean-Baptiste. Carter G. Woodson, founder, I believe, of Black History Month. I love this quote here. The portrait of the N has seldom been drawn, but by the pencil of the oppressor, a new method of approach, however, is now possible. So what is that new method of approach? I suggest that it's creative resistance, and I'm not the first, nor should I be the last person to suggest this. Creative arts are good for you. They're good for health education. They're good for us, right? So they're good for you individually, like as art as intervention, improves mental health, improves this, improves that. That's great. It's good for learning about things and communicating about things. That's great. But it's also good for us collectively. And that's what I'm mostly concerned about, right? Art is what is going to hold us together. Art is that mode of resistance, of counter narrative, right? It is good for capital US us, right? Every social movement and that has been relevant to something that's related to the population health, right? Every social movement has had arts behind it. And the fact that we think that we can credential folks to become public health professionals and not have a conversation about art as a requirement, I think it's silly because everyone that's listening to this right now, watching this right now, y'all were watching a movie, listening to music, drawing in your coloring book, doing all sorts of things, writing crayons on your wall and shit, calling it a dragon and just look like a bunch of circles. Y'all were doing all those things way before you heard about public health or epidemiology. And we think that somehow these things that we are just drawn to and connected to from very young ages that we hear in our homes and our communities, right? Creating an ambiance of connection and belonging and love and resistance and healing, all of those things that arts do for us throughout our entire lives. We get into a public health program, we're like, oh, fuck it, leave that shit outside. That to me is ridiculous. I think it's a space for creative resistance to make that revolution irresistible for health justice. I think I talk about the 5 Rs here. I'll just go through them quickly. This idea of rearticulation to form counter narratives that Antonio Gramsci talks about. Counter storytelling from critical race theory, also very much extending that notion. This idea of power from the margins that Bell Hooks talks about. This idea that I think she speaks to so well that resonated with me in undergrad when I read this as a first-gen college student. This idea that we come from the margins and we're moving towards center, moving towards that dominant culture and that dominant structure within those dominant institutions, right? We're moving from the center. Are we careful to make sure that we can get back to our home space, our home place, without losing too much, without essentially selling out, right? Have we allowed ourselves to be colonized, right? We went in to get what we needed with our technical training and everything, right? Are we able to make it back safely, right? How much of ourselves do we lose to play the game, right? How many times have we been quieted to the point that now that we're public health professionals, we're out here doing research on things that we actually had no intention of doing research on? There's folks watching this right now that decided to do a PhD program, but because of the power structure, your actual training goals and your actual voice got warped and trumped. And now you're doing something else that you actually had no intention of doing because the institution essentially told you that doesn't belong here. You cannot be your full self here. That's not relevant to this discourse, right? This is what Bell Hooks is talking about with the power from the margins, that we have certain things with us and when we try to move to center, sometimes those get erased from us, right? Sometimes they get stolen from us, right? Sometimes we're forced and coerced to leave those behind. What she suggests is that there's a real power there. So it's important that we hold on to that. And that's a power that no one else can have. If you don't share that site of marginality as power and resistance, you can't participate. Like you're not going to be able to do the things in that particular way, right? And honestly, I think that's what scares these dominant institutions, that they know they can't do what we can do. They know they can't see the world the way that we can see the world. And I think that scares folks. Public health critical race practice, of course, core to this. Shout out to Dr. Chandra Ford and Collins Area and Bua for this. Um, for me, what I highlighted here are the 4 principles that I tend to engage and uplift the most in my work, I think. Obviously, this entire talk is disciplinary self-critique, centering voice through creative arts, and then this idea of social construction of knowledge, which is why I started with Foucault and Patricia Hill Collins' work, right? Um, who determines what's knowledge and what's not? And are we actually waiting for like that perfect study before we take action? I don't think we are. It's political, right? We have enough evidence on most things. So why not try different methods, tell different stories, gather different evidence, right? The concept of rememory from Toni Morrison that she wrote about in Beloved and just written about and spoken about since, this idea that sometimes we are forced and coerced or traumatized into forgetting things about ourselves, about our communities, about our histories, right? And how important it is to sometimes engage in rememory, to remember those things, right? And not only to draw back on those memories, but to remember in a sense of like RE dash member, right? To reaccount for and to reclaim folks that have been erased or silenced from our own histories. And for me, I see this as germane to remembering our community knowledges, right? That we felt like maybe when we got into the MPH program and a PhD program, that wasn't relevant to our story or to what our training goals were, right? Or folks that have been in the field in public health or various other disciplines that public health tends to not engage, and remembering, reclaiming, and pulling that knowledge and that perspective and that history into the public health canon, right? Because the public health canon was not created with us, those of us at the margins in mind, right? And so how can we engage in this practice of rememory to kind of reimagine that and rebuild something else? This notion of generative refusal from Leanne Simpson and Resurgence and Resurgent Practice. In the context of resistance, generative refusal not only refuses colonialism, but it affirms a different present by generating different worlds, worlds that center the material and spiritual needs of the community. And that this idea of research and practice is disruptive and deliberate act of turning away from the colonial state. As I mentioned, I guess the best way I can try to describe this briefly is that, a lot of us, all of us in public health, especially those that are doing work on racial health inequalities, we arrived at an apparatus and a system and a structure that was built before we got there. And we can either come into this room and be like, yeah, that makes sense. That's dope. I love the colors on this wall. These chairs make perfect sense. I'm so glad that this is the menu right here. I'm like brilliant. It's seasoned perfectly. I love it. I love the curtains. This is amazing. We can do that, or we can start to ask questions about like, why are we eating this? Why is this on the menu? Why are the chairs like this? Who picked out those damn curtains? Those curtains got to go. This art is garbage. I'm tired. I'm taking this art off the fucking wall. Or a matter of fact, I'm not even gonna sit down in this room. I'm gonna go over here and we're gonna build a whole different room, and we don't want to touch none of those things, right? That menu, y'all can have that shit. It ain't working. That's not for me. That's not for my community, right? It's the idea that we don't have to accept what's in front of us, right? We don't have to try to make it work out. We don't have to try to refine that regression, and like we don't have to do those things. Nobody has to do those things, but we're conditioned that this is the only way to play the game. This idea of gender refusal is saying like, nah, we don't have to accept that. We can flat out refuse that and center what we actually need from our own understanding of what life and love and everything else is like in the margins. Um, and this for me is what gets us to epistemic disobedience, to just flat out disobey. Sometimes I have an issue with that word because it has like a connotation to it, but in this context, I'm like, you know what? Yeah, fuck it. Like y'all can do that. Keep doing it over here. I'm gonna do this right here, right? Fuck what they saying. I'm saying this. That's essentially what I feel like we need more of in public health, right? And like I said, there are plenty of folks out here in the public health, racial health equity research space that are either engaging in what Dr. L. Lett and Monica McLemore and Rachel Hardiman and others refer to as health equity tourism, or it's POC folks that have just learned to play the game the way that their white dominant colleagues have and are trying to win the game doing it that way, doing the same things, telling the same stories, right? I think collectively we need more folks to say, nah, we don't need to do that. We can try other things and push back on that. And I think this is what will allow us to suspend damage-centered narratives, as Eve Tuck talks about. She talks about having a moratorium on this damage-centered research. And so, like, every time you read a study about, like Black communities or Asian Pacific Islander communities or immigrant communities, right, or intersections they're in, it's always like, what's wrong? And it gives us narrative that these communities are nothing but sites of pain and depletion, right? How is that helpful? How is that helpful in Sinead Burch's language, right? How is that a helpful narrative, right? Can we not think of a more helpful narrative that might actually be more inspiring, more motivating, right? And if not, fine, it's not like what we currently been doing has saved us anyway, right? So why not try something else? So, long story short, or medium story medium, what I suggest is that we need to center this notion of epistemic justice if we're at all going to get towards health justice, because if we want health justice, we have to have better research practices, a better understanding of the type of knowledge and the stories we need to tell to shift social and political action, right? Nobody is voting based off an odds ratio. Sorry, y'all, like y'all can do whatever you want, whatever data you're working on right now, but like fundamentally, no one's gonna cast a fucking vote on that. They're never gonna read your paper. They're just not, right? And that's fine. We don't all have to be out here be the ones that doing the things, right? There's a lot of us, and we add it all up, maybe we get to health justice. But what I'm suggesting is that even if we add up all these dope ass methodologies and all this positivist things that we're doing, that's not the reason why we haven't gotten to where we want to get to, right? Nobody is waiting for that perfect study to hit the button on, let's do something about this, right? That is not what's happening right now. We need to be politically attuned and produce knowledge and create stories about our communities, about what we want, not just what we don't want, but what we want, that will actually motivate and inspire people to do something different. And I think that's the power of arts and poetry. I think next time I'm gonna try to reach out to Jean-Baptiste and see if I can use an audio clip right here. And just like when I hit the button, it just cues up, the hook of the song. If y'all know what I'm talking about, take a deep breath, drink water. It'd be dope just like to cue that up, make it a little more interactive. Um, anyway, having said all that, what I try to do in my work, as I outline, I continue to develop this concept of people social epidemiology, is to integrate some of these things into doing work that is place-based, specific communities to center and uplift stories that are, kind of aligned with what's going on there for that particular community, and not really concerned about how it compares to some other space, right? How to make it inclusive, how to make it action-oriented and politically attuned. And part of this work is through the Youth Health Equity Action Research Training Program. You can see the training modules here on the left. A lot of folks, no surprises to anybody watching this, I imagine, they don't really know what public health is when they're 14 or 15. Everybody knows what a medical doctor is, what a nurse is, various other things in healthcare, but public health kind of is the one that folks don't really have the much knowledge of, right? Like they know it in terms of like having lived it, but they don't have the language necessarily for it to call it a thing and to really engage it like that, right? So we start with Public Health 101 and working through a bunch of modules up to a youth participatory action research YPAR project. We use participatory methods and we engage creative arts. And one of the projects we did with this, the first one, I believe, we worked with an artist in Portland, Sharita Town, created some zines and some buttons from their things, and they designed their own hoodies to wear for an art exhibit that we ended up not having because COVID shut it down. This is like in March when I think they worked on these designs maybe like 2 weeks before that COVID came and shutdowns came. But engaging arts through and through, right? Zines, pins and buttons and hoodies, right? There's a different way they can tell their research, share their research with the community. That doesn't have to be through a peer-reviewed paper necessarily, right? In terms of public health poetry project, quick origin story here, right? I'm gonna go take a trip down memory lane. Shout out to Nas. So this is a map of where I was at when I was in high school. What this map shows is based on data from Opportunity Insights, Raj Shetty and folks up at Harvard. It basically just shows the probability of me starting where I started and being where I am right now in terms of social class. So being low income, poverty, African American, and male, to be from the lower quintile of income to the top quintile of income, based on 1980s birth cohorts, right? And basically what this shows that I had a 0.3% of being a 0.3% chance of starting where I started, being born in the 80s and growing up here, and now as an adult, being where I am social class wise, right? 0.3% chance of being where I am social class wise, but a 9% chance of being in prison. I think that what Raj Shetty and everybody else who just downloaded tax records and IRS and Social Security records didn't know is that I had my homies and I had my family to hold me down, right? So what they were getting is a bunch of red things on a map, these red choropleth maps that we do in GIS and place health research, right? They had some secondary data, they analyzed some things, and they thought they knew some shit about me and didn't bother to come and have a conversation with nobody. They fucked up, they got it wrong, right? And I'm not the only one, right? That's what I'm saying is like, this is what public health is trained to do, is to just do this to us all the time. If you are situated in one margin or another, like you're accustomed to reading about yourself like this, like you're just a red spot on a map and you hear nothing else about you, your homies, your family, your history, nothing. All you learn in public health about your own communities, if you're coming from the margins, is all the things that are wrong. Um, I had an issue with that, of course, right? What I was doing when I was living in that space was doing a whole lot of writing poetry. I took 10 years off because public health convinced me that maybe this isn't the space for that. And then when I came back into the poetry game, I wrote this paper that got published in Health Education and Behavior. It ended up winning the Paper of the Year award, and they wanted me to record it, so I did, and I created some album art for it that was inspired by Nas's Illmatic album. Because then I remembered, right, how it started. I wrote myself into college through writing statements and poetry, right? I went to college to do creative writing. Um, and then I went back and I did my dissertation work in the community I grew up in, where they just mapped us all red, and we filled that map with other stories, with counter narratives, using creative methods, right? Things that traditional public health research, especially on racial health inequalities, just can't even imagine or entertain, right? There's no apparatus for that, right? You can't even get things like this funded most of the time, right? So for me, it was important to remember that and to reclaim and center that story as a part of my own scholarship. I wrote a paper a couple year or the year later got published in Health Promotion Practice, Poetry as Praxis and Illumination, drawing from Audre Lorde's work, that got Paper of the Year award. And it was that combination of things that led to an invitation with Dr. Sinead Birch and Dr. LeConte Dill to create the section in Health Promotion Practice, Health Promotion Practice as the first ever standing peer-reviewed poetry section in a public health journal. And it is all because I had the audacity to write a poem about, public health violence, essentially, right? The narratives around COVID when they started were so colorblind and racist and pathologizing, but there was a history of that, right? It happened with the 1918 flu, it happened with syphilis, it happened with HIV. Public health has this, proclivity to just be epistemically violent, right? There's a fear out there, and the folks that are creating the narratives, these dominant narratives, aren't thinking about what's actually going on, right? And so for me to write an essay on that and put a poem to it as well, um, is, what kind of opened up this pathway. And I feel like what came clear to me through that process is that I wasn't the only one out in the public health space that has an interest in creative arts and that wanted to see these things published, right? And so having this poetry section now has been something marvelous, and we hope we can keep it going. If you're a poet, send us your poems. So I say all those things because the story starts somewhere. In order to get to where the thing is right now, I had to go and essentially make the thing. I had to write the papers and write the papers and win the prizes and win the prizes just to justify getting a grant to do poetry workshops with Black youth, right? So we do poetry workshops with Black youth at Self-Enhancement Inc. in Portland, and then we also do annual poetry competitions with SEI youth and also youth from Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, or APANO. And the plan is to compile these poems over these competition years, 3 years of competitions, into chapbooks, and that process will probably start this sometime in the summer. We also did workshops with SEI youth. It's just an example of the workshop prompt, and just to give y'all a feel for the type of thing that we can engage in, right? This prompt was about climate change, and open-ended, right? It didn't have to be like all the damage and the harm, right? Just like climate change, just have some fun with this. Insert whatever you want to insert and tell a story about climate change and your connection and your concerns around the things, right? The space was healing in and of itself, right? Single-handedly, like the single most meaningful, powerful thing I have ever done in my public health career and training, right? Like, I didn't evaluate this, and someone's like, "Oh, did you evaluate?" If you're thinking that, like, I'm just like, that's some white logic coming out, right? I don't need to evaluate this. There was so much Black joy and love and healing in this space. Like this right here didn't need to be evaluated, and I'll die on that hill. I will never evaluate this public health poetry project. And that's partly why I'll never get a grant for it, because they think I have to come in and ask them questions about their GPA and their school attendance and their blood pressure and shit. I don't have to. I don't have to reduce this to some fabricated bullshit metric, right? There was so much Black love and joy in this space. It was an intervention, right? It was resistance. It was all the things that public health is lacking. I don't need to evaluate it. It was just the most amazing moment, I think, that I'll probably maybe ever have, right? So for me to keep doing this work is really important. And I think for the youth that attended it, it was also an important experience for them, right? Stats and Stanzas, something that came out of the poetry project, kind of came up with this based on a poem I wrote in the International Journal of Epidemiology. Stats and Stanzas and bars and bar charts is the idea. We have an annual poetry event that brings the competition winners from SEI and Apano to read their poems with also featured poets. We bring in a DJ and we do the thing, and we have some fun, and there's a whole lot of love, and there's food, and it's delicious, and like, DJ Dante, like, it's just dope. That's public health work, folks. And what we intend to do with this project next is do the geopoem thing. Um, Basically taking the poems. So the poems that these youth at SCI wrote were based on their photo voice locations from the Y Part project. So there's a photo voice narrative. They write a poem about the place, and then they record the poem on site of where they took the photo. And the idea is to kind of integrate all these things to create this version of their neighborhood, right? And so moving away from this narrative, this Black geographic peril that, Catherine McKittrick talks about in that red choropleth map, right? Moving away from that representation of space and Black place, right? To something like this. And I think I'm gonna stop there. I got a couple more slides, but I want to make sure that there's some time for questions and all the good things. So I'm gonna breathe, I'm gonna drink water, and I'm going to skip to the end. Yeah. And if there's questions about any of these things that you're all looking at, I can always go back or share slides or something like that. So just to close out, I think fundamentally we have to start asking ourselves about matters of epistemology. The fact that schools of public health, accrediting programs think that we can do social justice, anti-racist work without fundamentally talking about knowledge power relations. It's ignorant as fuck. It's almost like, who's making these decisions? I'm sorry, y'all. Like, some of y'all might be watching this, and honestly, like, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. Like, it makes no damn sense. We can't think that we can train folks. They get a master's program and a PhD program to acquire knowledge and we're not even talking about what counts as knowledge. Like, it's just fundamentally flawed. It's whack. Like, we need to do better than that. We have to engage questions of epistemic, procedural, data, and distributed justice, engage in disciplinary self-critique. So I need to see more of y'all out here creating presentations, talking shit like this, basically. We need to be disobedient. We need to disrupt. And then we might allow ourselves the potential to engage in radical possibility, right? And I think that's how we can make sure that we're really doing the most. The gender refusal, the moving of the furniture, the repainting the walls, changing the entire damn menu, building an entirely new restaurant, right? That's how I think we can ask ourselves if our methods and our data and evidence are in line with anti-racist decolonial practices. We can't decolonize within a settler-colonial structure. That shit doesn't make any sense at all. And so at the end of the day, does the arc of our work and our story bend towards epistemic and health justice? Right now, it's not bending anywhere. Right now, we have folks who are getting credentialed to do what's always been done. Even if these folks are coming from the margins themselves, we're trained to do what's always been done. So we're going through this process in the same way that everybody else who's not from the margins went through the process. What makes us think that we're going to be capable of imagining something different? We have to really critically engage in this. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Stop share. The mute.
Ryan, there was a question a while ago from Hadijah C. Mills, who asked, as students interested in exploring creative epistemology, what tangible strategies would you suggest to push against the normative structures of the academy? More frankly, how can we get the university to validate Black joy as a methodology?
Oh, Black joy as a methodology. Yes. The first, I think they're the first. I might need to be reminded on the second one. Um, I think it depends on context, right? I know at my institution right now, they're going through this process of like the curriculum revisioning thing that I'm sure like most schools of public health are kind of trying to keep track of or do things in that space, right? I think it starts with each class that you take, right? Like I know that like if you're in a master's program or a PhD program, PhD programs have more flexibility, obviously, right? You do some core things and you could pick and choose some other classes to supplement your training in. But for particularly MPH programs, it's very structured, right? It's like you get 2 years, 60 credits, you only get 9 elective things, right? That whole structure needs to be challenged and questioned, right? The core competencies on the CEIF guidelines, the foundational, what they call foundational competencies, right? Those all need to be, I don't know, there's a word for it, I'm not going to use it here, but basically they need to be reworked. In terms of once you're in this space, I do think it's a matter of every time you take a class and you look at that syllabus, you should be looking at it asking like which stories are being told through the syllabus, right? Whose voices are heard, like who are the authors, what's the social locations of the authors? Who's telling whose story here, right? So if you're reading about things, who's writing it? Is there an alternative way in which the story could be told? Is it always going to be quantitative things? There's a qualitative version of that, right? Is there a way in which there is creative art and expression that maps onto this, right? I didn't get into it, but I use music in all of my classes because anytime you read a study about a thing, somebody wrote a song about that same thing. I can almost guarantee it. And so I feel like as a student, as somebody who's going to be a future practitioner or scholar, um, like we can make demands, and I say we because like I'm still a learner and I'm in my institution, but also when I was a student, I don't necessarily think I had the courage to make those demands, but I say this like we collectively, because whoever asked that question, you're probably not the only one that's thinking about this, right? And so I think that there's the bigger picture things like accreditation guidelines, right? But there's also the day by day, like you have to take these credits, you have a professor, you have a syllabus. I think it starts with really interrogating a syllabus and asking questions and asking and opening up that conversation with the faculty member. And I think that faculty member, is doing what they need to be doing to move towards health justice. They'd be willing to have that conversation.
Thank you for that. Another question from Jerry. I'm hoping you can speak briefly or recommend resources about the importance of valuing multiple ways of knowing, and importance of addressing mis or disinformation, which has become so prevalent. How do we do both well?
It's a great question. I wouldn't be able to suggest or offer any resource off the top of my head, but I could make the slides available to folks perhaps. There's some of the material that I went through regarding counter narrative and suspending damage and things of that nature. I think are relevant to that conversation. Well, specifically for mis and disinformation. I haven't really spent a lot of time specifically engaging that discourse, right? Like I understand the concern there, but it's from a public health perspective, I haven't really been following that thread and that scholarship, specifically with that, that specific language, right? Because I take that to mean a very specific type of communication, right? And what I'm talking about is more broadly about the broader narratives of our field. Um, but yeah, I think that in terms of the broader things, I think some of the things I shared would be a good place to start in terms of the paper trail, which is why I always put the sources on the side so folks can kind of follow up on those things.
Thank you for that. So I think this is oh, I see two. So how do I not get bogged down in the fear of security or scarcity that white logic relies on to keep us doing things the way that it has always been done? Thank you, Martha.
I mean, thank you, Martha. That is the question right there. So I didn't tell y'all that. I think I maybe alluded to this. Our points. I went to college for creative writing. I didn't end up finishing. Didn't end up majoring in creative writing. I wrote a poem and a song in like 2009, and I didn't write another poem or a song to perform or record until 2020. And part of that was because of smothering, right? Like I felt like I couldn't do that in the public health space and be seen as a real public health scholar. And that was at Berkeley, y'all. Now, nobody on my advising team, my dissertation committee, told me that I couldn't do that, right? And indeed, they understood that I was creative. But it was like the structure overall. It was like clear that like if I had done this, especially as an African American male, that was going to be problematic in the sense that like, oh, of course he would do like poetry and spoken word and hip hop, right? There isn't very much a stigma and a fear attached to that I carried, right? And I think that's in part why I went 10 years between engaging in creative arts and my own training and career, right? And so I think that question is really important. I don't have an answer to it. I think it's different for each of us in our context, right? What I will say is important is that thinking about this and having this conversation, being willing to have this conversation with folks who you actually feel some type of trust and rapport with, right? Because my best bet is that you're not alone in this. I don't know what the cohorts are like in schools of public health everywhere, but I imagine that there's going to be a few folks that are looking around like, what is this? On your internet in your program, you said this, but when I get here, it's really a bunch of this. And what I'm looking for is this. I think that finding some homies that can help you think through that process is good. Finding a faculty member, hopefully someone who's tenured, because oftentimes for a lot of us before we're tenured, especially for people of color and women of color especially, it's a lot of labor to be able to figure out a way to support this type of work within our institutions, right? So finding a tenured faculty member who is amenable to this conversation is also good, right? Because you need someone to ride or die for you, essentially, right? I know in my institution, I've been mentoring a few students that have formed a BIPAC organization to have these conversations in spaces, create a space to have these conversations in, right? But I think that question is perhaps fundamentally the most important question. But I think the more of us that are talking about and thinking about it and making demands, if slowly finding our voice, it won't come to you all at once. It didn't come to me at once. It took a damn decade, y'all. It took a decade in 2020, and y'all know what happened in 2020, right? It took a whole lot for me to just say, okay, what do I have to lose, basically, right? I think that process will be different for each of y'all, but I do think that yeah, trying to figure out who your allies and your ride or dies might be is a good place to start.
Thank you so much. A couple of people are asking what's the best way to get in touch with you.
Yeah, you can email me, my email in the chat.
Or follow your work, I think. And so I'm so grateful that we were able to connect. I actually saw some of Dr. Petway's work and was like, oh, I need him here. I was doing my own research for school and I was like, we need him to speak to our students. And so I'm really glad that you were able to come and spend some time with us. Appreciate it. And thank you all for coming and engaging. We will post this if that's okay. And please feel free to reach out to us for other ideas and questions about the series and the work that we do here. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.